Good day, everybody. This is our fifth session. We started, if you remember, by an overview of how to do research. Then we spent more time on how to come with a topic, how to write your title, and so on. And then we moved to the literature review section, which is to tell us about what we already know in our field, and those who studied the same topic before us, what did they find? And we said we need to make clear that we're searching for a gap somewhere in the literature, so our research, our piece of research would fill in anything debatable, anything missing, any finding that was based on assumptions or normative analysis, what ought to be, rather than empirical analysis, and so on. And then we moved to a fourth part in which we discussed how to deal with the possible fallacies, mistakes that we might commit while we are doing our research. That was called argumentation and avoiding logical fallacies. This session, we will be talking more about this specific aspect of how to conceptualize and operationalize. What I mean by that is you need to be specific about the concepts you are using. Otherwise, you will end up examining the wrong concepts, or a concept that is vague, that is ambiguous, that is indeterminate in a way that would confuse you and hence confuse the reader. That's why we need to spend some time understanding this process of conceptualization, and if we are going to do quantitative research, we need as well to convert our concepts into measurable indicators that would eventually become our variables. That's why we'll spend some time trying to understand how to conceptualize and how to operationalize. It looks complicated, but it is easier than falling in love. It is easier than anything you would do in your life. You just need to follow the following steps and the following logic. Okay. What do you mean by conceptualization? It is practically to clarify what the terms you are using mean for yourself and for the reader. How would we do that? Actually, we do that by 4 techniques. You can think of them as 4 steps. That's fine. If you follow them, eventually you will end up having a clear understanding of the terms you are using and how to use them in an accurate way. For instance, a concept like disease. What do you mean by disease? Okay, I can tell if I'm sick, but how to define sickness in terms so everybody else would understand that you are talking about the same meaning. What's democracy? By the way, all countries of the world claim in a way or another that they are democracies. No country on earth, maybe with the exception of Saudi Arabia, that does not misuse, or abuse the word democracy. But what does democracy mean? How would we know if this country is democratic or not democratic? The same goes with liberal. Which country is liberal and which country is not liberal? And if liberal can be measured on a scale from 1 to 100, which country is 5 and which country is 50 and which country is 75, and so on. Wars, what do you mean by wars? Any kind of threat would be a war, or we mean by war is actual use of force. Okay, if show of force is not a war, so what is a war? Or even show of force is war. We don't know until you, in your research, define for us what do you mean by the word or the term war. Definitely, you need to build on the previous literature. Remember, we did literature review. And part of your reasoning why you would do literature review is that you want to know what researchers before you did when they used the same terms and concepts. What did they do? Do you agree with them? Do you want to adopt one of their definitions? Or you need to come up with your own definition? Are you close to school A of defining a certain concept, or you are close to school B in defining your concept? That's why literature review is one of the important guides for you in this stage of conceptualization and operationalization. However, you, me, everybody else would eventually need to come up with a linguistic definition, meaning using words to define your terms or concepts. What do you mean by that? Okay, what is democracy? Question. What is democracy? I need you to give me a linguistic definition, a definition that is based on words. So now I would understand what do you mean by the word democracy without confusing it with other terms or concepts. Okay, you might go back to the Greek. See, the Greek defined it by differentiating between demos and crassy. So part of your linguistic definition, what's demos, what's crassy? Demos is the people and crassy is rule, so rule of the people. But here you will need to contextualize it in a way or another. Okay, what did they mean by the demos? Were the demos at the time everybody? Or we meant mainly men with properties from Athenian background and so on. Okay, so you need to be specific. What do you mean by demos? Okay, but others use the term democracy from an institutional perspective. In other words, they used linguistic definition, but from an institutional perspective. They focused on issues like voting, like elections, like processes of this sort, like voting, elections, balance of power, peaceful transfer of power, and so on. Okay, that's another perspective. Still linguistic in the sense that you are just using words to tell me what you mean by that. Others use something like normative perspective. Like what? It's a system that is based on certain principles like equality, like rule of law, like justice, like liberty, and so on. People even can give us more of that. But what we did here is what? We said democracy comes from the Greek origin, demos plus crassy, and I define demos, what demos is, the people. But at the time, the Athenians used to limit the participation in the political process, in the democratic process, to propertied men above 21 and so on. Okay, you can say, and other schools, and you can give references and cite some scholars, say would define democracy from an institutional perspective based on the institutional arrangements and processes like voting, elections, balance of power between elected bodies, like peaceful transfer of power according to elections, and so on. And you can refer to a third group of scholars who focus mainly on the normative or principle-related aspects of democracy, like equality, rule of law, justice, freedoms, and liberty. And you can extend that, of course, and say freedoms like freedom of belief, freedom of expression, freedom of association, and so on. Okay, so all this is a linguistic definition telling me what you mean in mind by the term democracy. Meanwhile, it might not still be clear enough, especially if you are not talking with a term that is widely used, like the word democracy. It might be you are dealing with something like embedded state, for instance. What do you mean by that? Or you are using a term like civil society. What's civil society? Or you are using a term like, for instance, civic religion, that was used by Rousseau and Voltaire and so on. What's civic religion? Here, you might want to, as well, beside the linguistic definition, you might want to give an example. That is to tell me what examples, okay, what are democracies? So you might say something like, oh, okay, if this is the case, then USA is an example, and you can elaborate more on why you think USA is an example. You might say England is an example, and you might elaborate why England is an example. Japan is an example, why, and so on. Okay? So I need you to tell me what you mean by that, by actual factual examples from reality. Definition by example is, if you're talking about something like identity crisis, what's identity crisis? After you're defining identity crisis here, okay, then you might say countries like Southern Sudan or Sudanese of Southern Sudan before secession from the Republic of Sudan had this identity crisis. Kurds have an identity crisis. Muslims or Arabs of Israel, those are the Arabs who have Israeli nationality and Israeli citizenship, have identity crisis. So I need some examples, so I don't know what you mean by whatever you said here, so clarify it in a way or another. You can as well show your master, your capacity to understand your concept by excluding terms, saying, oh, but this does not include this definition or conceptualization does not include. Give some examples. You can give an example like, okay, this does not include China. Okay, this does not include, for instance, North Korea. And you need to tell me why, so I understand exactly what you mean by it. Definition by classification is part of the conceptualization process. It's very important to tell me, are there different degrees of your concept? Are there countries that are, what I can say, 80% democratic, and countries that are like 50% democratic, and countries that are like 30% democratic? I need you to classify to me the different manifestations of the concept. So, for instance, you might say there are consolidated democracies, emerging democracies, there are authoritarian states, and there are totalitarian. Why you're doing that? Of course, you need to always have in mind that you are doing everything to answer the research question. Consolidated democracy is a type of democracy that democracy is the only game in town. No matter what other entities, other political forces want or plan to do, nobody will get into a position of power without elections. No unelected body or unconstitutional body can stop the power of people as explicitly stated in free, fair elections from happening. No coup d'etat is possible, you see. In emerging democracies, no, they took some steps toward democracy, but we cannot call them consolidated democracies. Usually, when Lenz and Stepin used these consolidated democracy term, they defined it in a very, of course, in so many ways to clarify what it means, mainly linguistic definition, but as well came up with a very interesting way of understanding it. That's what I said, to be the only game in town. How would we know that? They said we can come up with a valid and reliable indicator that there are three processes of transfer of power. That is, X got to power, elected. Then X left power. This is the first time. X left it to Y. And then party X got back to power. This is the second time. Party Y got back to power. This is the third time. If this peaceful transfer of power happened three times, then we can claim that this is a consolidated democracy. Why? Because this means that it has been institutionally and culturally accepted that democracy is the only game in town. Okay, remember that Hitler took office in 1933 based on elections that were, at the time, somehow we can call it free and fair. But this did not lead to consolidated democracy because he got the power once. So one person, one vote, one time. So Hitler's democracy was not a consolidated democracy. What about emerging democracy? When Hitler took office for the first time, we can call that this was an emerging democracy because it's voting and elections that were free and fair. But then it ended up being authoritarian, then totalitarian. That's why you have this classification saying consolidated democracies like England. How many times England had this peaceful transfer of power? Definitely more than three. France, Norway, Spain, and so on. Okay, so this is consolidated democracy. And you classified it and you give examples for each one of them. Emerging democracies are democracies that started to have this institutional arrangements, but we are not sure if they're going to continue to be consolidated or is going to break down to become authoritarian or even totalitarian. Okay, like what? Oh, Tunisia can be emerging democracy. Maybe like a country like Cuba at some point would become emerging democracy if they have free elections. Definitely South Korea in 1990s when they first had their first free fair elections. It was an emerging democracy and later on it became democracy. Actually, I don't know if I can call like a country like Iraq a democracy at all. But again, you will need to conceptualize the word democracy because yes, it has voting, that's elections, but I don't know if it has balance of power. Okay, it's balance of power not based on institutions, it's based on racial and ethnic and so on. Does it have equality? Do Iraqis behave on equal terms? Do they have rule of law? Do they have justice? Do they have freedoms? Do they have the liberties? So here you will need to question if Iraq, I wouldn't say democracy if it is a stable state. And here you might want to see if being a state is a requirement for you to become a democracy, okay? Because you need to have a state first, right? It's like you have your phone, the physical phone, before you have an operating system, whether it is Android or whatever, okay? So you don't have a state, so how is going to become a democracy, okay? And so on. So here you need to examine your concepts well. And when you talk, say, democracy, here is a democratic state. It has to be a state first, say, and so on. Okay, so if we say these countries are like from 80 to 100, if there is 100, 80% to 100% democracies, emerging democracies like from 50 to 79 emerging democracies. That is on a scale from 1 to 100 being democracy or non-democracy. Authoritarian states might be from 25 to 49. Authoritarian state is like some kind of soft authoritarianism in the sense that it's like Mubarak in Egypt. It was like we had staged and fraud voting elections. Definitely we did not have balance of power. We definitely didn't have peaceful transfer of power, and so on. But to some extent, it was not totalitarian either, because people used to speak up a bit in a way or another. There were Muslim Brotherhood in the streets, in syndicates, and so on. Totalitarian states would be states where there is an official ideology and it is obligatory ideology. Any other ideology is unacceptable and can end up putting people in jail or in tombs or in exile or whatever. Okay, like China, like North Korea, like Cuba under Fidel Castro, like Ghana under Nkrumah, and so on. Okay, so what did I do now? I used 4 ways of how to define democracy. You can do the same thing with your main with your main concepts that you will be using when you're doing your research. If you are examining the relationship between globalization and inequality, what do you mean by globalization? I need a linguistic definition. Then I need another example or a set of examples of what we mean by globalization. Is this rapid transfer of COVID an example of definition? I'm sorry, of example of globalization. Opening up markets between countries is an example of globalization. The spread of one language, which is English language, because of the internet, is now making the world communicate easier with one language, is another example. So what is not globalization? Okay, when you say this is not an act or part of globalization, what do you mean by that? Okay, civil wars. Would civil wars become something related to globalization? No, civil wars existed before globalization and definitely will remain as long as. You can say something, the infringement on society's values, is it part of globalization or not part of globalization? Invasion of cultures by foreign terms. Are you going to include this as part of your definition of globalization or no? It is not something else. It's just the traditional communication and cross-fertilization between societies that we used to have since Egyptian old pharaohs invaded what's today Syria and Jordan and Palestine, and people get affected by the invaders. When Arabs came from Saudi Arabia to Egypt, Egypt definitely got influenced by them. So what do you mean by globalization? Is it related to a specific time, or it is a permanent process? So you need to tell me what is not globalization beside giving me an example of what it is. Okay, classification, is it economic globalization? Is it political? Is it ideological? Is it intellectual? Is it technological? Is it? So I need you to classify it for me so I understand all its manifestations. Okay, inequalities. When you say I'm going to be examining the relationship between globalization and inequality in two countries, maybe Algeria and let's say Saudi Arabia, maybe. Okay. What do you mean by inequality here? Racial inequality, religious inequality, income inequality, legal inequality, gender inequality. You need to be very specific about that and give me examples and exclude what might be confused with your original definition and so on. Okay, so using words to define your terms. Let me say that I am going to complicate things a bit just for the sake of the operationalization. Using words to define or to articulate what? The core characteristics of your terms and concepts. This is very important. Core characteristics. Not things on the margin. You see, core characteristics. For instance, when you define democracy, don't tell me that democracy somehow includes a high level of income society. If you're going to do that, then you are not talking about democracy as it's traditionally used in political science, because we know that democracy might emerge in countries that are not rich enough but are poor. Like India is always a great example. Definitely Brazil is not India, but we cannot call it a rich country. Mexico, of course, is another example. So what I mean is, don't confuse your term with other concepts that might be related to your original concept. For instance, we understand what liberalism is. Liberalism is to accept, from a philosophical point of view, is to accept points of view of others as if they are your equals. If somebody is believe that socialism has some positive aspects to add to capitalism, okay, I should not do what I told you in the logical fallacies to strawman his argument and eventually say, oh, he wants some aspects of socialism to reform capitalism, so he's going to end up asking for a socialist revolution and communist revolution and end up being a totalitarian state. No, he didn't mean that, right? So don't confuse liberalism with democracy if you want. If you want to say something about liberalism, so define it as is. And define democracy and tell us there can be countries that are liberal but not democratic. It might happen, yes. Egypt, for instance, before 1952, it was characterized as liberal society. At the time, Muslim Brotherhood existed, the Liberal Party existed, there were Al-Ahrar al-Dusturiyin somehow to the right existed, socialists and communists existed, so it was very liberal society. We had Jews, we had Italians, we had Greeks, we had, of course, Christians have always been here, and so on. So it was a liberal era. Lots of freedom of expression, and so on. But was it democratic? No. If it's a matter of voting, elections, and respect for people's will, no, it was not. Like Al-Wafd Party, during this period from Constitution of 1923 till the revolution of 1952, the majority party, Al-Wafd Party, ruled only 3 years. Why? Because the king did not respect whether King Fuad or King Farouk. So here, it was liberal, but it was not democratic. Can we have in some other countries examples of democratic and illiberal democracy? Yeah, it might exist. You might have free, fair elections and all these great things that we have just here, but within Islamic terms. You don't allow, for instance, if you want to, you would not allow communists or secularists or whatever. This is what Iran claims, for instance. Iran claims that it is democracy, but under Islamic Sharia. So it's everything is acceptable as long as you are under the Islamic umbrella. Of course, you need to have a critical eye. Would that is an illiberal democracy or no? Okay, some people who focus on the procedural aspects of democracy, the institutional aspects of democracy, say yes, as long as they have voting, they have elections, as they have balance of power, they have peaceful transfer of power, and so on, then it is democracy, even if it is not liberal. Others say, no, it cannot be democracy if it has all these, has all the liberties and freedoms and so on. You need to locate that in the literature and eventually come up with your definition and convince us why you are adopting a procedural or institutional perspective or normative perspective. Okay, you need to show the core characteristics of the concepts you are using and tell us what other manifestations of it, what examples you have, what like counter examples that you do not include as democracy, and come up with a classification. By the way, the consolidated democracy, emerging democracy, you might add here something like electoral democracy. I'm just brainstorming with you, which is just electoral. It takes from democracy just elections. So this would be more democratic than this because it has the electoral dimension, it has elections, but it has some of these normative aspects. Okay, consolidated democracy would have both, would have all the institutional perspective and all the normative perspectives. Emerging democracies would have all the institutional and the electoral aspects or procedural aspects, and would later on have, and would have all these normative aspects. Authoritarian states wouldn't have that or that. So especially when we talk about voting elections, free, fair elections, and so on. Okay? So this is what we call conceptualization. What about operationalization? If you are doing qualitative research, quality, then you don't need operationalization. But you will need to do that extremely well because this is the only thing you got. Okay, you need to come up with all that because this is the only thing you got. Okay? If your research problem is relating, for instance, economic development to democracy, then you need to do that kind of conceptualization to the two terms and any other important terms you will be using in your research. Okay, conceptualize for me what economic development is with all these four aspects of it. Okay, and then later on you will be linking them. If you are going to measure using quantitative methods, quantitative techniques, your concepts, then you will need to operationalize or operationalization. What do we mean by that? We need a valid and reliable indicators of the concepts. I need indicators that would tell me if this concept exists or the manifestations of this concept exist or do not exist, and if they exist, they fully exist, they partially exist, somehow exist, never exist, will never exist, and so on. So I need you to come up with the indicators, then to measure the indicators, then to convert the concept with its indicators to a measurable variable. I'll tell you what we mean by that in a bit with its indicators into measurable variable. Usually in research, you're going to find people confuse the words variable with index with scale. For us, they are the same. And eventually, you know, when we do our conceptual framework, when we do our theoretical framework, we'll need to see who leads to what, which one is the independent variable, which one is the dependent variable. Okay, so economic development and democracy, which one leads to the other? What is the relationship between them is what we call dialectical. Dialectical means that it's two arrows. This leads to this and this leads to this. This might hinder this and this might hinder this. Okay, if this is the case, what are the defining conditions that sometimes make economic development lead democracy and sometimes economic development does not lead to democracy? Okay, under what defining conditions, what circumstances that change the interaction between democracy and economic development to make democracy leads to more economic development, and sometimes democracy does not lead to more economic development. Okay, so but this we will do in next session. Okay, I'm talking about valid and reliable indicator of the concept. Okay, so let's spend some time understanding what we mean by that. A reliable indicator is an measurable and observable measure or technique for us to know the core characteristics of the concept and their indicators, which means that we need a consistent and dependable way of knowing whether democracy in this country is 5 out of 10 or 3 out of 10 or 9 out of 10. Okay? If economic development is 2 out of 5 or 7 out of, 2 out of 10 or 5 out of 10 or 7 out of 10. It's exactly, I need a scale. In other words, if we use this scale to measure the same construct, the same concept multiple times, do we get pretty much the same result every time, assuming the underlying phenomenon is not changing. In other words, if we use the same set of indicators, I'm going to call them, reliable indicators. To measure the core characteristics of the concept, and somebody else uses the same set of indicators, we both will end up with very close, if not similar results. If I ask X, please give me on a scale from 1 to 10 an order with measurable number assigned to each country. Which country has higher level of economic development? Egypt, Sudan, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco. He or she, the person, needs to come up with reliable indicators. Meaning what? Looking at the GDP per capita, looking at education level, looking at people under the poverty line, and so on. If these measures are reliable, so if I ask X, Y, if I ask X and Y, they will come up with very close results. But if X is going to measure economic development of these countries using GDP, and Y is going to use it, is going to use people under the poverty line, then with the first case, with X might end up saying Egypt is the richest. But the other person might end up saying, you know what, Algeria is the richest. Here it is not reliable. Why? Because we are using different indicators to measure the core characteristics of the concept, without here actually defining the core characteristics of the concept. Is economic development about GDP growth, or it is about poverty line? What do you mean by economic development? So you go back to here, conceptualize economic development, and then when you come up with the core characteristics of your term, then go to search for indicators to measure them. If you define economic development based on economic growth, GDP growth, then you're going to be measuring something according to certain criteria. Or if you are going to use people under the poverty line, that's another measurement. Do you know, in between Ahli and Zamalek, we had a very interesting discussion regarding who is the club of the century, Ahli or Zamalek. Ahli is saying what? Ahli people are saying, I am the club of the century because I scored more points than El Zamalek in most of my games. In other words, I played a certain number of matches and games and end up having the highest number of points. Zamalek is saying, no, we Zamalek are the club of the century. Why? Because we got more trophies. So this is a measurement, and this is another measurement. Don't put yourself in this situation. You need to come up with one reliable indicator, or a group, not one, I mean a set of reliable indicators to measure for you what economic development is. Somebody might say, but it might be very difficult. No, that's why you do your literature review. Your literature review is there to help you, telling you all these professors, researchers, senior researchers have been working on that for the past at least 60, 70 years, coming up with different ways of looking at different political science and political economy and political sociology and political anthropology phenomena. You just need to read carefully and end up coming up with your reliable indicator. Okay? An example of an unreliable measure is people guessing your weight. Okay, what's your weight, Mu'taz? Somebody might say 70 kilos. Somebody might say 75 kilos. Somebody might say 80, 82, 85. Okay. Quite likely people will guess differently, right? And this becomes inconsistent. Then their points of view are not reliable indicator because they disagree. And if you ask 15 people, you're going to end up with 15 different results. Okay, so the guessing technique of measurement is unreliable. A more reliable measurement may be to use a weight scale, mizan. When you have a scale, then it's going to tell you, okay, you are Mu'taz, you are 85. But being 85 does not mean it's accurate. It might be biased, but in a consistent way. The scale increases my weight by 2 kilos. So each time I am on the same scale, I end up being 82, 82, 82, 82. But when I go to another scale, I find myself only 80, 80. Why the difference? Because this scale is reliable, but not valid. Reliable, but not valid. I'm not 82. It's all the time giving me 82. But I'm not 82, I'm 80. So I need, beside being reliable, that is always giving me the same result or somehow the same result, it needs as well to be valid. That's why we have this great picture here. You see, this is what we are targeting. the circle in the middle. If you come up with an indicator that is really measuring the core characteristics of the concept, all of them will be here. All your indicators will be here around this area. So here, that's reliable and valid. It's exactly like I have an arrow that or a gun and I'm shooting at something. The shooting is valid and reliable if all of them are here. But it might be valid, meaning yes, it is somehow in the middle. You scored 2 in the middle, so it's valid, but it's not reliable because each time it gives you a different result. No, that's not acceptable. We'll see how to avoid that. Here it's reliable but not valid, meaning it's totally biased in the same direction all the time, and it never hits the middle. So it's very reliable. It's like the scale. Okay, if you exactly like ask a Muslim guy or an Islamist guy to define terrorism, he's going to do everything in his capacity to tell you that most of these events that are happening in Egypt are not done by people who call themselves Islamists. All Islamists, if you ask 15 Islamists, all of them are going to deny that killing police officers or army officers in Sinai are terrorists. Yes, they are reliable, but they are not valid. All of them think alike, but in the wrong direction. So you need again to define your concepts, your core characteristics in a way, like here, that would make your indicators like this. All of them are valid and all of them are measuring the same thing. Not this phenomena and 2 other phenomena with it. No, not this phenomenon and other phenomenon with it. Okay. So we need a valid indicator, validity. Usually we call it construct validity, but validity is enough to measure adequately, a measure that adequately represents the underlying construct that construct here. Okay, let me put it that way, or characteristics of the concept that is supposed to measure. I'm going to give you an example, and this example is going to be very interesting. There is something called Human Development Index. We guys got confused at some point in the past regarding how to know if a country is doing well economically or not. Some countries have very high GDP, but there is skewness in the distribution of the GDP. In other words, yes, they are very rich, but like 2% or 3% control like 70% of the national income, of the GDP. How would we know if this country is developed or not developed? That's why we wanted to come up with operational conceptualization to tell us, using valid and reliable indicators, which country is more advanced, more progressive than which country, but not from the perspective of the country, but from the perspective of the people. That's why this gentleman, Mahbub al-Haq, is a Pakistani economist, came up with a measurement that was eventually adopted by the United Nations, and actually there is a full book that is issued annually examining this index, Human Development Index or Human Development Variable. It is a statistical composite, statistical meaning numbers, composite, it's like index of different aspects of life expectancy. Okay, if you are very rich, but you have a very poor health system, how this is good for the human development? No, it is not good. A country might be extremely rich, but most of its people are poor. How would I know if they benefit from this income or not? The life expectancy. when you are born, what is the expected life for you? How would they do that? In each country, we are going to ask people died at what age. For instance, in Egypt, you might find the average is 74. Oh, X died at age 25. Y died at age 105, and so on. Got all these numbers collected and add them together and divide them by the total number of people whom we asked about their age, and then this is going to give you an average. This average is your life expectancy. Okay, so the first thing that we measure in Human Development Index, and this is, as I said, this is our variable, and it has no first indicator, life expectancy. I will ask later, is it valid and reliable or not? Okay. Number two is education. To what extent people are literate or illiterate? Okay, very rich country, but most people don't read and write. So they are rich. They have lots of palaces and resorts and mansions and so on, but they don't have schools. They don't have universities. You see? So you have a problem when it comes to people benefiting from their wealth. So we need to know the literacy rate and gross enrollment ratio. Gross enrollment ratio, the total number of people who actually go to school. Because literacy rate is telling us that people in the past did not go to school. Now I need to know as well how many now are going to school. That's what gross enrollment ratio. And net attendance ratio. They might be just on paper, they go to school, but in reality, they do not go to school. So education is the second indicator. But this indicator needs three sub-indicators: literacy rate, gross enrollment ratio at different levels, and net attendance ratio. So 1, 2, 3 are the sub-indicators to measure education. And the third indicator for the Human Development Index is per capita income indicators, meaning to what extent there is enough money in the country adjusted by or taking into account the number of people. By the way, the GDP of Egypt is almost the same like the GDP of Israel. But Israel is like 8 million people, and Egypt is like 100 million people. So both of us produce annually almost the same amount of products and services. But we are 100 million people producing X, and Israel 8, 9, 10 million people producing the same X. Okay, so that's why the GDP per capita in Israel is very high. Why? Because the number of people is relatively low, and the GDP, the total services and products produced annually is huge. In Egypt, it's the same, as huge as Israel, but we are 100 million. Okay. When you do that, this is what they use in the Human Development Program, as if the United Nations Development Program, they use to compare countries. A country scores a higher HDI, so higher Human Development Index, when the lifespan is higher, when your expected life is higher, and when education level is higher, when the gross national income is higher. I'm not going to go through PPP. That's another story. Okay, what about countries? When you click on this link, it's going to show you the total number of countries in the world. And Egypt, I remember it was like 116 or so. So meaning what? This is a valid and reliable indication or indicator or index, meaning a group of indicators to understand how countries are developed or underdeveloped. Okay, so this is a good example of what this is. But be careful when you do conceptualization, I'm sorry, when you do operationalization. Why? Because there are sources or invalid or unreliable observations or and social science measurements. Like what? Is your own biases. I am Egyptian, I don't want Egypt to look bad. So I'm gonna come up with a conceptualization process and operationalization process that would make Egyptians don't harass women, for instance. Don't harass as they are. So we wouldn't refer to verbal behavior like things we say as part of harassment. I'm going to just conceptualize the word of sexual harassment to mean only harassment. Okay, so physical harassment is harassment, but verbal, no. Linguistic, no. I'm not going to say anything I say, because the majority of what we do is people saying things to women. So because I'm biased towards my own country, towards my own culture, towards my own religion, I am going to trick, to manipulate the conceptualization and operationalization process so it would not end up being that. So your own subjectivity, your own biases might create a problem. That's why consult your literature to see people before you and spot their own biases too. Because if you are going to use somebody's conceptualization and or operationalization, you need to make sure that it is not biased, it is not invalid, and it is not unreliable. So be careful. Okay. A second source of invalid and or unreliable observation comes from the fact that sometimes people or you are using terms that are imprecise or ambiguous. If you ask in a questionnaire, how much do you like KFC? And you have a scale, Likert scale from 1 to 5. 1 is I hate it totally, and 2 is I hate it somewhat, and somewhere in between you see I'm neutral, or I like it somewhat, number 4, and I like it a lot, number 5. Okay, this person is going to choose what? What's KFC? Of course, it's Kentucky Fried Chicken, but if it is not clear in the minds of all the people responding to the same survey, so I'm not sure what they are responding to. Somebody said, I like it because they thought it's a car. Somebody did not like it because they think it's a disease. So if it is not in the minds of everybody, then it is not reliable. And even if it is valid, by the way, KFC is valid for Kentucky Fried Chicken, but it is definitely unreliable. Why? Because people are going to interpret it differently. Okay. Or are you in support of WMD treaties? What's WMD treaties? Weapons of mass destruction. But how many people would answer the survey keeping in mind WMD treaties actually means weapons of mass destruction? So you're going to end up with what? You know what? You're going to end up with this. Yeah, it's valid somehow, but not reliable. Each one is picking it somewhere because each one is interpreting it differently, right? You know, you want an example for a reliable but not valid. If I ask somebody saying, what is your opinion about the greatest decision made by President Sisi regarding devaluating the pounds? You see what I said? What do you think of the great decision made by President Sisi regarding devaluating the pound, the Egyptian pound? Oh, I created a bias because I made everybody in a way. My question is clear, so people understand what I mean. But all of them are going to end up being here. So it is reliable. All of them are going to be biased. All of them are going to say, you know what? This researcher is coming from state police, and I don't end up being in jail. So I'm going to say, oh, that's a great decision. Oh, yeah. Okay, so it's reliable in a sense that all of them are going to be responding in the same direction. But it's not valid. Why? Because I'm not really measuring people's approval rate of this decision, because I biased all of them in a reliable way. All of them are going to be in support of it. But this is not valid. Okay? So just be careful not to confuse people, not to use terms, or you yourself are confused about the term. Okay? Make sure that you use your terms in a clear way, so you understand while you are writing, while you are correcting data, what you really mean, and so on. A third source of invalidity and or unreliability is asking questions about issues that the respondents are not very familiar about or care about, such as asking an Egyptian college graduate whether he or she is satisfied with Canada's relationship with Slovenia. Okay, it's exactly like you are getting to a reference that is going to bias your result, what actually it has no value or no weight in your research. It's asking somebody about something that they are not familiar with. So just be careful when you come up with an indicator to get it right. Okay, let me now I need to come up with some kind of valid and reliable. This is an exercise for us together. Reliable. Reliable. Keep changing it. We keep changing the word reliable. Valid and reliable indicators of whatever, what do you call it? For instance, religiosity. Okay. Why? Because religiosity is going to be my independent variable to ask to what extent people support or do not support terrorist acts. Okay, so what are these? How would I know if somebody more religious or not religious? Okay, in a scale, let's say this is a questionnaire. In a scale from 1 to 5, tell me what you think about the following. I'm trying with you, I'm playing. Okay, number 1, I totally believe that
one is enough sometimes.
There is God. Sorry. I totally believe that there is God. Number 2, I pray to God each time I run into problems. I make sure to go to house worship at least once a week. I don't support it. Claims that there is no God. Or, and I would put for each one of them one, I'm sorry, oh yeah, make it A instead of 1. A, strongly disagree. B, strong agree. C, neutral. D, neutral. Agree. E, Of course, this will be under each one of them. Okay. Remember when I said if you are going to do quantitative. Okay, so now we want to measure religiosity. I totally believe that there is God. Okay, when I use the word God, that's in English, of course, it's understood. Is there anything in here that is unclear or biased? No, I totally believe that there is God. I strongly disagree, no. So this means this person is totally unreligious. Agree and so on. But what if I do something like there is one God called Allah? Okay, you see how this is going to create a problem? This is going to create a problem of validity. Why? God called Allah. It's as if I'm asking everybody, Muslim or Christian, the same question, but I am biased toward Muslims. So Christians are going to say no. They don't believe that. Non-Arabs are going to say no. I believe there is God, but I cannot call this God Allah. You see, Allah for me is not the name of God. Might be another name. If this is the case, this is not a valid indicator. If I expect Muslims to respond in a way that is different from Christians or non-Arabs are going to respond, this is not valid and not reliable. But when you just make it like that, called Allah, removing this and saying there is one God, then it is more valid and more reliable. You see what I mean? I pray to God each time I run into problems. If this is the way, yes, it's any kind of problem. But if I put something like financial problems, why only financial problems? This is going to create a problem because this is going to be unreliable answer because I run him whenever I have problems, whether financial or non-financial. Somebody else say, yes, mainly financial problem. So some people, for them, the word financial is going to make them say strongly disagree, mainly because the word financials. And others might end up saying strongly agree because of financial. In other words, do not confuse yourself and others. Is the word financial here is going to add to the validity and reliability, or is going to reduce validity and reliability? Okay? Once a week. Once a week, so you are taking into consideration that, for instance, Christians don't have to go to church except once a week. But if you say once a day, then most Christians are going to be out of the scope of the measurement. It's not going to be valid or reliable because Muslims understand it in a way that is different from how Christians understand it. I don't support atheists' claim that there is no God. Of course, first of all, you need to make sure that people understand what the word atheists mean. Okay? I do not support as is. It looks valid and reliable. Everybody would understand what it means. It is like the scale that is accurate. But if you add something here to confuse people, it's going to take them to be mainly strongly agree or to be mainly strongly disagree. I don't support atheists' claim that there is no God and this God is whatever. So don't confuse yourself and confuse others. Make sure when you try to do a valid and reliable, to come up with a valid and reliable indicator, that it means the same thing to you and to everybody else. And it is actually measuring your definition of religiosity. You need to define religiosity, to conceptualize it first. Tell me what the core characteristics are, then come up with questions in a survey, if you're doing survey or a questionnaire. So eventually these 4 questions are indicators to measure this concept, religiosity. I'm going to finish up by showing you this interesting comparison between operationalization and conceptualization. Conceptualization is process of defining or specifying concepts. Operationalization is the process by which a researcher precisely, accurately specify how a concept will be measured. So don't tell me Egyptians are more religious than Israelis. Okay, ask Israelis the same 4 questions. Make sure that they mean the same thing to all Israelis. And I'm going to ask the same questions to all Egyptians. Then I will measure. I will tell you. But if you use terms that are confusing, when Jews read them, get confused, when Christians read them, get confused, when Muslims get confused, then it is not reliable or a valid measurement. Conceptualization involves defining or specifying what we mean when using certain terms. This is what we call the core characteristics. What do you mean when I say democracy? Nasser's regime was democracy, Sisi's regime is democracy, Mubarak's regime is democracy, and so on. Involves developing specific research definitions that will bring about empirical observations. The word empirical means observable. So observable observation, representing those concepts in the real world. What I mean by democracy, what do you mean by democracy? Oh, how many how many elections, free and fair elections happened in a given country in a given period of time. The main purpose of conceptualization is refining and specifying abstract concepts. You see, abstract. Okay, have you ever seen democracy walking in the streets? Or liberalism or Marxism or no, these are just abstract terms. The main purpose of operationalization is to remove the vagueness and making sure that the concepts are measurable. Measurable means observable. Yes, I didn't see democracy, but I saw people voting. Okay, I saw people voting. So what's measurable is the voting. Okay. First step in the measurement process is this. For sure, you need to conceptualize, to come up with the core characteristics. Then you will eventually need to tell me how you will be measuring these concepts. Hopefully, you got what I mean, and hopefully this was a useful session for you. See you guys next session. Thank you.